Welcome to my presentation on the Brazilian auto industry and labor militancy. My name is Natasha. I go to Guelph. I'm doing my master's degree in Latin American and Caribbean studies. And I actually wrote this paper as one of my last assignments at York, where I did my undergrad in the same program. So as you folks may know, the Brazilian Auto Workers Union was famously militant. And so I'm going to start with some research questions to kind of guide my, the structure of my presentation here. So one, how can we understand the historic growth of the Brazilian auto industry as part of a global process? Two, what role did Brazilian auto workers play in influencing the shift toward the democratization of Brazil in 1985? And three, what challenges do Brazilian auto workers face today? So in order to address these questions, I started my research by looking at a book called Forces of Labor by Beverly Silver. And she's an American professor of sociology at Johns Hopkins University. So looking at forces of labor, Beverly Silver wrote this book in 2003 during the major wave of globalization studies. And forces of labor looks at global instances of labor militancy within and between sectors in order to observe patterns of capitalist crisis and contradiction. In particular, Silver shows how workforces are constantly being made and unmade, and that worker-capitalist relationship is always in tension. So my paper is partly informed by Marxist and Polanyian theory, which Silver uses in Forces of Labor, and it's partly informed by Brazilian political history in relation to the auto industry as a development project. So talking about my thesis argues that by establishing an auto industry in Brazil that operated using the Fordist mode of production, capitalists and elites anticipated civilizing racialized Brazilians and unintentionally created a powerful workforce which would oppose the military dictatorship. So now we'll get to the history of the auto industry in Brazil, which will hopefully show how the Brazilian case fits into this global pattern of capitalist crisis and contradiction. So contemplating cars in Brazil, at the 1925 first exposition of automobility car show in Rio, the most attended event was watching the assembly of the Ford's Model T car. And according to Joel Wolfe, who's a Brazilianist scholar, it was one thing to imagine a new imported technology such as the automobile being used to unify a massive country like Brazil. It was quite another for Brazilians to imagine themselves as capable of building such machines. So Brazilians were optimistic about the transformative powers of cars, which had the ability to defy space and time. And this was especially important in a world that was revolving around clock time. In the 1920s, Brazil was very far from having the infrastructure needed to have full automobility, but at this time, elites were beginning to discuss the necessity of constructing roads and highways across the country. So Fordism meant two things. It meant securing a loyal workforce of respectable and hardworking men, and it meant promoting American mass consumption. Looking toward the United States as the yardstick for modernity and development, elites imagined a modern Brazil with car consumption, car production, and automobility. Elites and politicians revered Henry Ford as a cultural and technological innovator. So Henry Ford introduced a new mode of production by creating the assembly line, which de-skilled labor so that anyone could be taught to do a single task on the line. Fordism included many worker benefits like a high salary, standard work hours, and the ability for workers to purchase the products that they made. Looking at the Fordist mode of production, Ford reduced the bargaining power of skilled metal workers and made a new working class, which he could hire and fire as he needed. But on the other hand, the Fordist mode of production had new vulnerabilities. If you sabotage one part of the line, the whole assembly line would come to a standstill. And car production using the assembly line was expensive and required a lot of high-tech equipment. This meant that the threat of outsourcing production was relatively low, giving workers the upper hand in times of conflict. So Ford saw himself as someone who could civilize men and had a white savior complex. Ford was seen as an equal opportunity employer, but he racially segregated his plants and surveilled workers at home. Black men were appointed to the most dangerous and dirty jobs in Ford's Detroit plants, and in their personal lives, Ford workers were surveilled by their managers in a system reminiscent of slavery. Ford workers were not allowed to drink, and they were expected to be family men who attended church and adopted middle-class consumerism. Brazilian elites desperately wanted Ford to open production plants in Brazil. They wanted to buy Ford products, they wanted the government to improve automobility, and they wanted to civilize racialized Brazilians. Even though Ford's Amazon rubber plantation, Fordlandia, was a failed experiment, Brazilians were impressed by Ford's ability to transform indigenous Amazonians into a respected working class. Fordlandia workers embodied American values. They shopped at the Fordlandia supermarket instead of fishing and foraging. They went to the company cinema, and they went to the company church. So Ford opened plants in Brazil, but these plants only assembled completely knocked down units. And these were cars which were made in the United States and then imported to Brazil for assembly. During the ISI period brought on by the Great Depression, Brazilian industries had to become more self-reliant. So in the early 1950s, President Vargas opened a national steel mill and constructed highways, which improved the auto industry and automobility in Brazil. In the late 1950s, President Kubitschek further improved the highway system and constructed the capital city of Brasilia, which was located near the center of the country, and it was designed for automobility. Kubitschek mandated that cars produced in Brazil had to be made of at least 90% Brazilian-made contents. And this caused Ford and GM to stop car assembly in Brazil because at this time they were still able to produce cheaper cars in the United States. However, other foreign companies like Volkswagen decided to come to Brazil to begin full manufacturing. And the comparatively low cost of wages in Brazil was an incentive to establish Fordist automotive production. So the ABC Paulista region is the industrial belt of Sao Paulo, and the region responsible for car production as of the 1950s. Most auto workers were mixed-race men who had migrated from the Brazilian Northeast to Sao Paulo, delivering on the Fordist promise of civilizing racialized men. According to Lula da Silva, auto workers in the 1950s and early 60s got something like 10 raises a year. They were the elite, they had houses, they were the first to buy televisions, the first to buy cars. The 1964 military dictatorship confronted an economic crisis caused by Kubitschek's development projects. Brazil was terribly in debt and inflation was volatile. So in response, the military dictatorship suppressed wages and crushed unions. Looking to the global north, Fordism was now in crisis and auto workers were often striking or sabotaging production. Fordism was no longer economically viable in the north. During the dictatorship in Brazil, many foreign auto companies like Ford and GM moved significant operations to Brazil to exploit the favorable capitalist conditions of poor workers' rights and cheap labor. And it's worth noting here that in the 60s and 70s, car companies disinvested from North America and Europe and strategically moved production to countries with dictatorships. So at this time, car production was led by Brazil, South Korea, and South Africa, where there were dictatorships. So the military dictatorship was able to control inflation by suppressing the wages of auto workers, initiating the era known as the economic miracle. The Sao Paulo auto industry had become the backbone of the Brazilian economy, and Brazil was exporting cars all over Latin America. Auto workers remained a socially respected working class, but made the same salary as any other industrial sector. And these auto workers could not afford the products that they made. They were upset that their wages were not keeping up with inflation, while they remained such an important sector for the Brazilian economy. Rapid urbanization increased tensions in Sao Paulo, which was becoming overpopulated, and constructing highways had actually allowed for the migration of people from the interior who competed for jobs in the city and contributed to this overpopulation and the growth of informal work settlements. So auto workers in the ABC Paulista region launched a massive strike in 1978. The strike was supported by the popular classes for two reasons. One, because it openly challenged the dictatorship, and two, because the auto workers were seen as respectful family men. They were a working class that held a lot of social legitimacy and maintained high degrees of bargaining power. Different sectors and religious groups joined the strike, which lasted for 41 days, and it halted car production in Sao Paulo. So the immediate result of the ABC Paulista strike was not great for the auto workers. Union leaders like Lula da Silva were jailed, and salaries were only marginally increased. Auto workers also lost a lot of income while they were on strike. And either way, in the aftermath of the auto workers' strike, there were so many popular strikes that the military dictatorship had no choice but to transition back to democracy in 1985. So looking at the Brazilian auto industry since the 1990s, auto industries are now owned by multinational corporations. And the auto industries are once again moving production to areas where wages are low and there is no union presence, creating new workforces. So this new strategy is called greenfielding, which is where auto production facilities move to smaller towns in Brazil and use a new production technique called just-in-time production. This new style involves operating a constellation of smaller subcontracting networks that create different car parts and then ship the different car parts between the facilities as needed. And the final product is assembled by a small team. So what does this mean for labor militancy in the Brazilian auto industry? Auto corporations are disinvesting from the ABC Paulista region, just like they did in Detroit in the 1960s. And organizing labor in the new greenfield sites is incredibly challenging since production is divided between so many plants. One promising sign of labor militancy is that workers in the old ABC region are forming alliances with auto workers in the new regions and instructing them on how to form unions and bargain for better wages. Beyond a regional scope, auto workers in different parts of the world are able to form transnational worker networks, especially with the use of the internet. So one example of this is when a Volkswagen plant in South Africa went on strike, the Brazilian Volkswagen workers, in solidarity with the South African workers, agreed not to work overtime. So luckily, just-in-time production is still vulnerable to worker sabotage. If one of the many production facilities goes on strike, the whole system is debilitated. So it's weirdly kind of similar to how the assembly line operated. And to conclude, I think it's really interesting to think about how the 1920s Brazilian elites envisioned this white cosmopolitan society that adopted US-style consumerism. And the auto industry held the promise of car production, car consumption, and automobility, but mass car consumption became an unfulfilled promise, and automobility created new social problems. In the end, racialized auto workers who became model citizens under their new social position used their position to disarm the ruling class during the dictatorship. And for me, this shows how the history of the Brazilian auto industry kind of evidences that like capitalist production will always be undermined. And Brazil is just one of the cases that kind of like highlights how global patterns of capitalist production always come with crisis and contradiction. And that's the end.
Okay, great. Thanks, Natasha. Is that the same Lula da Silva as the current presidential candidate?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. He has a very cool history with
story. Yeah. That's
yeah.
Really cool. So next is Giuliana and Guilherme, who are presenting on digital management and the peripheralization of the labor form in contemporary capitalism. So when you guys are ready, I will start the clock.
Okay, let us just start sharing your screen 1 moment. It needs to, yeah, okay. Is everyone able to see the screen?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fine. Okay. Okay. So this is Giuliana. I'm Guilherme. We are both graduate students in Canada. We are both from Brazil, and now we are doing our master's degree in Canada. She's from York University. I'm from a social and political thought program, and I'm from Concordia University. I study philosophy. And this is our presentation, digital management and the peripheralization of labor form in contemporary capitalism. Here, this is our main argument. Let me just take this out from here. Okay. This is our main argument. We will take from the works of the Brazilian philosopher Paulo Arantes and Ludmila Abílio, and we'll try to demonstrate how the peripheral way of life has become generalized and productively manageable through new technical means. And to argue that we will use concepts such as Brazilianization and Uberization to understand this phenomenon, and also we will talk about some empirical studies by Abílio, Aliança Bike, and Aguiar. This. Okay. So I will start my part of the presentation talking about, just a second, I'm not sure. Okay, I will start my part of the presentation talking about the concept of Brazilianization and peripheralization. So Brazilianization is an idea that tries to make sense of this new big wave of social polarization that was happening in the United States in the mid-90s. This term was coined by North American authors. It was not used by authors in the global South. And nowadays, we can see that this term sort of tackles into this kind of underdevelopment that could be seen in developed countries. So the argument here, and this is Paulo Arantes talking, is that in the heart of the biggest metropolitan cities of developed countries, we could see this very intense dual configuration between what Paulo Arantes talks is the included and the excluded from modern capitalist society. He also talks about a dualization of society split between the winners and the losers. And he argues that the faster capitalist modernizes itself, the faster society becomes more archaic. So in this sense, Paulo Arantes, he speaks of a regression in progress. So I will skip a bit some of the examples Paulo Arantes uses to characterize this dualization of society, mainly because of time constraints. And I will just talk about what matters to our presentation. Let me just skip a slide here. Okay. And so the idea of peripheralization also means this recycling of underpaid workforce. And to Paulo Arantes, peripheralization is the actual term he prefers, because he thinks that Brazilianization is kind of a misnomer to the phenomenon that those North American authors were trying to describe, because those contradictions, they were common to most countries in the global South, although in Brazil, we could see those contradictions more clearly. So what happens is the growth of the post-industrial sector leads to this regression of labor, which reaches levels of exploitation and misery. And here I'm quoting a little bit Karl Marx, levels of exploitation and misery analogous to what occurred in the time of the Great Pyramids of Egypt. So what happens, what was happening in the mid-90s was the dismantling of the state as a mediator in the relations between capital and labor that leads to this extreme growth of the informal sector, intertwined with information-based economy situated in the metropolitan regions of major urban concentration. And we will talk about this economy of informational economy in a while. So the dualization of workforce splits between the informal sector, that it's no longer just something related to extreme poverty and mere survival activities, but something much more widespread, as seen as precarious work, and the formal economy, information-based. Both are intertwined and feed off each other, while at the same time they exclude each other. So this causes the constant, Paulo Arantes talks, this constant strangulation of the middle class, while at the same time it pushes society into its extremes of extreme poverty and extreme opulence. So society becomes even more dualized. So the higher classes, they identify with this advanced high-tech services, and their self-containment and exclusion of the rest of society does not mean reclusion. So they have a privileged access to circulation and cross-border nets of accumulation and social power, while the lower classes are territorialized workforce. So the rising high-tech ecstasy is identified with the ultra-selective, deterritorialized space of flows, and this is a term by David Harvey, that leads to this cross-border accumulation, while the lower classes, they are re-territorialized by immobilization. This can be seen in its most brutal form as mass incarceration, as an example. So the labor sphere becomes each time more unstructured and precarious. Workers, they lose their social securities and are seen as authors of their own self-construction. So they kind of lose their collective unity and they become corroded by an extreme negative individualism. Okay, just gonna. So the idea here is that this Brazilianization or peripheralization, it's kind of hand in hand with what David Harvey calls the flexible accumulation. So when we think about flexible accumulation, at stake is the unexpected return of absolute surplus value extraction strategies made possible by these new technologies of production organization. We'll talk about, for example, platformization or Uberization in a while. So the flexible accumulation comes from the combination of two classical surplus value extraction, relative surplus value and absolute surplus value, combined with different alternative modes of labor coexisting in the same space, like a combination of formal and informal labor by the same capitalist, a typical form employed in industrialized peripheral countries. In Brazil, that's something very common. So this in and out of workers in the illegal job market is made possible by the arbitrary application of the law. The flexible accumulation regime demands a strong regulatory apparatus without limits. Paulo Arantes, he talks about a regulatory fury manifested in this passionate dismantling of the labor market. So it's not only the poor class workers confined between unemployment and various forms of precarious, underpaid labor who feels this regulatory fury, but also the realm of formal labor. So the regulatory fury is constantly circumventing contractual norms in a way that generates an epidemic practice of firing employees, even in the formal labor market, which throws an even larger number of the population into informality. This illegalism made legal makes professional categories disappear from the statistics and union representation. These workers, they are not outside labor market. They were just made invisible by new regulations. And to finish my part of the presentation, and then Giuliana will continue, I'm going to read this quote by Alex Facciolli. It reads, just a second. Here. Modernization everywhere meant the destruction of old feudal vestiges in the countryside, urbanization, and the incorporation of the masses through formalized work in an industrializing society. The undoing of modernization through its principal process, the coming apart of formal employment and the rise of precarization, is the root of the whole phenomenon of Brazilianization. Growing inequality, oligarchy, the privatization of wealth and social space, and a declining middle class. Its spatial urban dimension is its most visible manifestation with the development of gentrified city centers and the excluded pushed to the periphery. And now Giuliana will continue presentation.
So most recently, as the result of decades of convergence between technological development, labor flexibilization, and precarization, and even the restructuring and globalization of productive chains, the phenomenon of Uberization came to light. And the outcome of this process has been the consolidation of global dispersion of labor without weakening of its subjugation, especially because it was carried out in conjunction with process of capital centralization that gave rise to new forms of organizing, managing, and controlling labor. So additionally to this, Uberization should also be understood as a tendency to generalize certain characteristics found in southern labor markets, and which have most recently become more visible after spreading to central countries. So here for us, and especially in the words of Ludmila Abilio, the South category refers to elements such as the creation of individual survival strategies, the constant shifts between different types of occupations, the accumulation of different tasks, a lack of definition of as to what is and what is not labor time, and the performance of unpaid labor, and as well as the uncertainty and permanent absence of guarantees regarding remuneration. And nevertheless, despite playing a central role in capitalist development and in accumulation, when you think it in a more global perspective, this way of life, it has been persistently neglected and deemed marginal, at least until most recent transformations. So first, in order to understand how peripheral characteristics in labor forms have recently become subordinated to new means and have acquired more visibility, it is important to consider the techno infrastructure that allowed independent self-employed contractors to work by themselves and to take risks and costs that were formerly incurred by companies. So here, the idea of algorithm management, which we'll refer to as AM, it plays an important role because it potentializes and adds more complexity to the forms of controlling and organizing labor. And according to Zuboff, AM is the possibility of extracting, processing, and managing that data from a massive number of workers in a centralized and monopolized way, making it possible to effectively predict and induce behavior. So, for example, AM can fully map out distribution of a number of workers, as well as determine and alter this distribution in time and space. When you think about rankings of workers, for example, and AM can also permanently assess workers' productivity, benefiting more productive workers and punishing those who do not fit in their constantly changing remuneration rules, for example, through deactivation. So therefore, workers not only need to be always available for the work, in a sense that if every hour of the day is potentially work hour, this kind of blurs the boundaries between work time and non-work time. But they also need to engage in a form of subordinated self-management that requires workers to develop adaptation strategies to decipher and adjust the way in which AM organizes labor. And these strategies, they are also predictable and can be integrated into the software, for example. In this way, it has transformed, AM has transformed everyday survival strategies into managed data, incorporating a shoestring way of life into a monopolistic and rationalized form of management. And in this, as a conclusion, by highlighting these main elements, we can now understand, we can now start to understand how urbanization first materializes a qualitative change to flexibilization, and it has made visible a new level of real substitution of labor by combining algorithm management with the reduction of workers to just-in-time workers. We can also see how urbanization appropriates in a productive and administrative way the progressive erosion of the public realm as a fundamental field of work regulation. And furthermore, you can see that minimum guarantees are taken away while the worker remains subordinated. And at last, we can see that Uberization is not restricted to the unskilled and low-income labor offered by the platforms. It is, in fact, a powerful movement that has become a general trend in the world of labor. And it currently comprises millions of workers around the world with the potential to become a generalized tendency in multiple sectors. That's basically our main argument. Thank you for your attention. Those are references, and I think we can now proceed to the inquiries.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, guys. That was very interesting. So Simon, are you ready to provide some feedback?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both, Guilherme, Giuliana, and Natasha. These were really great papers, great presentations. There's a lot for me to try to unpack, but I have kind of a response in the way of questions, and then a couple of comments as well. I think it's best to do it if I just, Natasha, we do it in order of your presentation. And then I'll get to Giuliana and Guilherme. Natasha is a fantastic paper, a great presentation. I had read the paper in advance of today, and the presentation